Vumelana Advisory Fund is a non-profit organisation that works with land reform beneficiaries and has called on government to heighten awareness amongst the beneficiaries of the land reform programme. This includes laws and policies governing access to water as well as post-settlement support. I spoke a little earlier to Peter Setou, who's Chief Executive of the Vumelana Advisory Fund, to further unpack some of the challenges being faced by land reform beneficiaries, particularly around access to water use. The land reform process has been painfully slow and really has struggled to meet some of the expectations of many South Africans. A lot of these farms have become economically inactive. What would you say have been some of the contributing factors to that?
Well, there are a number of reasons to the state of affairs, but I think in the main, lack of post-settlement support. You must remember, at a point when government gives land back to our people, in most instances, they don't have access to finance. They don't even have access to markets. And in some instances, they don't even have the technical know-how to actually run some of this business. And that's why it's so important that a post-settlement support is actually provided to the beneficiaries so that they can put their land to productive use.
I know that one of the issues has been water use rights affecting land beneficiaries. What happens typically that these water rights are missing and yet they get land?
Peter, water and land are actually interconnected. And whilst both of these resources are actually critically important for sustainable development, they've often been managed sort of almost separately. I mean, for example, you've got water being managed by a different department and rural development and restitution being handled by a completely different department. So we have a situation where at a point of the transfer of the land, these rights, water use rights, are not transferred to the beneficiaries of land reform. And this in itself has created a number of challenges. I mean, we've got a number of projects that fail because water has not been availed for production. And really, this points to the fact that we need to make sure that there's synchronization between land reform programs and water allocation.
So who do you think is to blame here? Do the beneficiaries not know about their rights and they get excited about the land and then only realize afterwards, my goodness, actually we need the water to go with this?
I think there are a combination of factors. One, if you look at available water rights, I mean, 90% or up to 95% of available water usage rights are actually in the hands of big commercial farmers. And you've got about the remaining, about 5% or so, in the hands of your upcoming and mostly your black farmers. So you have a situation where your smaller operators and newer operators are actually competing for this scarce resource, first and foremost, with experienced players. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the regime itself, the licensing regime itself. I think it's a bit slow to actually take into account the fact that at a point when the land is actually allocated, you don't have the luxury of actually waiting. You need to start waiting the land. Thirdly, issues around access to finance. It's one thing to get the land and to even get those water use rights. Because remember, when you get this right, it means you must start paying for this water. So that's why the whole issue around addressing pertinent issues around access to finance for land reform purposes is so key. But lastly, I think just awareness amongst our people about the water use rights regime. I think there's a critical need for government in particular and other role players to embark on educational programs so that beneficiaries of land reform can really know the do's and don'ts and what to do actually to apply for some of these rights.
And do you think then laws, legislation, and some of these policies really need to be looked at?
Well, I think one must concede that when it comes to policy and legislation, we do have policies, we do have legislation in place. I think the challenge really lies with implementation. I think government needs to start really improving on how these laws and policies can be implemented. We need to make sure that we enforce some of these rights and ensure that there's compliance on the ground. Because if you don't enforce compliance, things are likely to remain the same. And lastly, I think we also need to make sure that we've got monitoring and evaluation systems in place. Because if you don't do monitoring and evaluation, then you can't actually effect any improvements, because you don't actually use the lessons that you would have gained from doing an evaluation as a basis to effect improvement. So I think this, for me, really go in tandem.
How do people go about getting these water usage rights? How difficult is that process?
Well, I think that's exactly the point. We need to demystify that whole process. We need to simplify that process. We need to make sure that there is more broader access to such information. I mean, the custodian in this specific instance is the Department of Water Affairs. And I think really this is a challenge for them to make sure that they can embark on awareness creation initiatives to make sure that people can be aware of these water usage rights, including how to access them, etc., and how to apply for them, etc.
You mentioned the slowness of the process. What kind of a backlog is there in terms of licensing of water use rights?
Well, the reality is, even before you start talking about the backlog, remember the problem that I raised earlier on to say, at a point when the land is transferred, we found in many instances that the land is transferred, yet the previous owner retains the water use rights. So that in itself is a problem that needs to be addressed. So that is the first thing. Secondly, once the land has been transferred, you have a situation where these beneficiaries of land reform don't actually know where to start in terms of ensuring that they can apply for these water use rights. That in itself also creates another layer of delay. Thirdly, once you actually apply, there are possibilities that either your application is lacking or there are certain things that you did not include, which might actually make the whole process a bit longer, which is why it needs to be streamlined. People need to be educated to say, this is what you need, because if people know exactly what is it that they need to do at a point of application, the process could be more streamlined, it could be more efficient, and those licenses could be issued more expeditiously.
You said that what often happens is that the previous owners keep a hold of the water usage rights. Is this deliberate or is this an oversight? What is happening?
Well, I think at the core of this challenge is the fact that I've raised earlier on to say water and land are actually interconnected, But unfortunately, you find that these two most important resources which are required for development are managed by two different entities, if you like. So you have the Department of Rural Development, Agriculture, Rural Development and Land Reform, responsible for, amongst other things, land restitution, for example. But you have another department which is really responsible for your water usage rights. So I guess it's a whole point of coordination to make sure that these government departments can start collaborating more closely to make sure that the processes are more smooth.
So these two departments, are they aware of the challenges that these land reform beneficiaries are facing and that you as advisors are having to try and overcome? And if that's the case, what are they doing about it? Well,
Peter, I must say, from our side, being on the ground as Vumelana Advisory Fund, we have certainly picked up some of these challenges. We constantly raise them. And it is for that reason that an organization such as ours exists, so that we can support beneficiaries of land reform to navigate through some of these challenges. We do that through, offering transaction advisory services through independent transaction advisors who would assist them to create partnerships with experienced, investors and landowners, etc. But coming to your point in terms of whether the departments are aware, I mean, we've had a number of reports already. We've got the panel, what's normally referred to as the Motlanthe report, which has certainly highlighted some of these challenges. There was also an advisory panel, presidential advisory panel on land reform and agriculture, which identified some of these challenges, including coming up with suggestions on how this could be addressed. So the information is out there. I think the challenge really lies with how do we make sure that some of these reports, including the recommendations of some of these reports, can be implemented. I think that's what we need to do as a country.
I want us to go back to perhaps where we started and look at the whole land reform process again. And I just wonder, as the targets set for the National Development Plan draw ever closer, what do we need to do to perhaps revive this land reform program and make it happen quicker and more meaningfully?
Well, a lot of this information is already available in the public domain in terms of what is it that we need to do. I mean, from our side, first and foremost, there's a huge demand on the government fiscus. For us to really expect government to deal with all these social ills and some of these challenges, I think we can forget if we are to make any meaningful dent to sustainable land reform. So the involvement of the private sector is key to make sure that there is development, which is why we are actually advocating for partnerships with investors in the land reform space who've got the requisite access to capital, who've got the requisite access to markets, who've got the skill sets as well. So that for us is the first thing. Secondly, we need to provide post-settlement support at a point of really transferring these land parcels to our beneficiaries. It's pointless if you give them the land without giving them some form of support beyond that, because it's almost like setting them up for failure. So for us, that's really the second thing. We've been talking about water rights. We need to make sure that the availability of water use rights is actually integrated as part of the transfer process, so that we don't have a situation where there's a lull from the point where the land is actually transferred to a point where the beneficiaries can start meaningfully working the land productively. So for me, that's one of the issues. But there are a whole range of other areas where we need improvement. With better collaboration, for example, within government, various government departments that are involved in one form or another in land reform. I think if we can begin to streamline some of those actions, we'll start seeing a lot of traction in that regard. But for me, what one needs to emphasize is, in the context of the current economic environment, I think it is critical that government should support, especially your partnerships with the private sector, to make sure that land reform is sustainable.
And that's where we're going to have to leave it. The Chief Executive of Vumelana Advisory Fund, Mr. Peter Setou, thank you so much indeed for joining us. And we wish you the best in helping our people with the land reform process.
Thank you very much, Peter.